I am so blown away by how I think oftentimes that if I just apply intensity right here, this idea that it's going to have lasting impressions later on down the road. For me, I do this all the time at home. 5 kids in my house. All the time we try and figure out what is the best way to keep this house clean, to do chores and do all these other things. So there have been multiple things that I've tried to implement at the house where we can give kids job. Hey, you do this, your job is this, you do these things. We're going to do it every single day. And probably about once every 3 months, we got to have this real intense meeting, right, where we sit down and I lecture everybody on how lazy they are and how much they need to help out around the house. I hope that I'm not the only parent that does those things. But I remember, I always sit down and I just have this intense meeting, like, you need to be doing this, you need to be doing this, we need to carry our weight around the house, with no intentions of really what it looks like later on down the road. Just thinking this intensity is gonna carry the process through. It's so easy to do that. And it's so easy to do that in life as well. If you weren't with us last week, we kicked off a series called You in 5 Years. And that's kind of what we're looking at, is how to live that life that we dream of in 5 years. How do we get to that point? If you missed last week's service, I would encourage you, hop on over ourjourney.news. You can go in there to media, find last week's sermon, watch that, because what we do around here is we take one sermon and we kind of break it up into a couple different weeks. So it's kind of all one sermon. So if you missed last week, hop back over there at some point, check that out. It'd be super beneficial. But today we're going to join Jeremy for part 2 of this series, where we're going to look at what we can do, how we can put into action and continue walking out and getting to that point of living the life that we dream about. We finished up last week, week 1, with the challenge of sit down, really get out a pen and paper, iPad, something, take some notes and really dream out what life could be like, where you want to be in 5 years. I did that. I sat down. I got super depressed thinking about my kids, really, because in 5 years I'll have an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old, and 3 14-year-olds. And in my mind, everything just kind of went blank there. And I'm just like, I don't know how I'm going to survive that. But after the initial shock of that, really being able to sit down and say, hey, I want my kids to be here in 5 years. I want my marriage to be here in 5 years. This is what I really want God to be doing in my life. Here's where I want our finances to be. It was really cool to kind of have that vision down on paper. And now we get to take those next steps into becoming and achieving those goals and those things that we set before us, instead of just having them out there and not taking those steps and moving forward. So why don't we join Jeremy for part 2 of our series, You in 5 Years.
Meet Billy. In 5 years, Billy will have spent 605 days sleeping and 2.5 full days brushing his teeth, hopefully. He will have sat in traffic for 9 full days. Billy hates traffic. And in 5 years, he will have spent 433 days working. Social media will have taken up 152 consecutive days of his life. He will have walked 3,650 miles and spoken 29.2 million words, hopefully good ones. In 5 years, Billy will have spent 76 days eating and drinking. Billy loves dessert. 2.5 years out of the 5 will be spent consuming media, with 228 days spent watching TV. Billy is messy. He will have spent 152 days cleaning. And in 5 years, he will have spent roughly $40,000 on food, 40 days shopping, and 50 days socializing with the homies. Welcome to You in 5 Years.
So last week we started a series we called You in 5 Years. And when we landed it, we asked you to dream about what you could possibly be like in 5 years. Where would your marriage potentially be? What could happen if you were to set a goal and say, I want to invest in my marriage? Where could that relationship be? How much healing could take place? Or maybe financially, you said, man, I want to set some goals to get out of debt and to be here in this place in my life. So just dream for a minute. And in fact, if you missed it, like Chuck said, go back and watch that. So helpful, so valuable. And really, like we talked about last week, this is not a standalone message series. This is a one message that we've divided up into several parts. And so my hope is that you'll engage in this story. But the question, like Chuck asked, is really, how do we move beyond dreaming into living? Because we've all had dreams and hopes about where we'd be, right? We've all thought, you know what I'd love to do is have a place at the river or a place at a lake in a few years. But it's a pipe dream. How do we go from the pipe dream, this crazy dream that doesn't really even make sense, to a reality life? How do we move from point A to point B? Well, getting from that idea where you are now to where you want to be later, it might be a little easier than you think, but it might be a lot more difficult. In fact, I want you to know something, that when we look at Scripture today, it's going to open up a reality in our life. But you got to get a couple of names straight first. There's a guy named Elijah. Elijah is the greatest of the miracle-working prophets. Throughout all of Scripture, when we read this, he has more than a dozen documented miracles, and it's crazy, some of them. I mean, he has this one point, he's like, it's not going to rain till I say it's going to rain. Like, literally, that's what he says. And he says it with like that sass in it. Like, it's not going to rain until I tell it it's okay to rain. And it doesn't until he says it's okay. And there was another time where he called down fire from heaven and defeated these other prophets of some other fake god. And it was crazy. I mean, he's the greatest of the miracle-working prophets. Then there's this moment in Scripture where Elijah is going to pass off his mantle, pass off his responsibility, his role to a successor, and he picks a man named Elisha. Now, I don't know why God wanted him to, get those two so closely named together, Elijah and Elisha, because if you ask me, they sound so much alike, I get them all mixed up all the time. Couldn't we have picked another guy named Billy or something so that it was obvious? But no, this is what we got. Elijah, the greatest of the miracle working prophets, chooses his successor, a guy named Elisha. And Elisha, when we pick up in his story, we find him in a farm field. Now I'm going to read a few verses to you from 1 Kings and 2 Kings and kind of catch you up. But where we catch Elisha is pretty crazy, because look at what it says in chapter 19, verse 19. So Elijah went and found Elisha, son of Shaphat. Now, I know that you're probably wondering, like, I can't really study anything about Elisha unless I know who his dad is. Well, good news. I mean, God put it right in the Bible for you. He's the son of Shaphat, and he was plowing a field. Now, that doesn't seem important, but it is, because look what happens next. There were 12 teams of oxen in the field, and Elisha was plowing with the 12th team. Elijah went over and threw his cloak across his shoulders and then walked away. So hold on just a second. Let me give you a little of what's going on. Elisha is a very rich young man. Now, the Bible says that he has 12 pairs of oxen. That's 24 oxen plowing a field. Now, having one oxen is a big deal in this time. Having two oxen is a massive deal. That's what we call a yoke of oxen. Two oxen that are put together, yoked together to make a productive kind of machine of plowing. They didn't have one or two. They had 24. 12 yoke of oxen. And Elisha was farming with those. Now, you got to imagine that in that day, in that time, this would be like having top-of-the-line John Deere tractors, but not just having one or two of them, having 24 of them. How much land does Shaphat Farms have to necessitate having 24 oxen, 12 teams of oxen to plow? They were stacked. So you got to get what's going on. Elisha is hard at work, and his dad's farm at Shaphat Farms, and Shaphat Farms is the place to be, right? I mean, like, if you're a farmer in the region, you know who Shaphat Farms is, because these people have got it going on when it comes to resources. Elijah has chosen Elisha, who's plowing, and he goes up to him, and while he's plowing away, Elijah takes his coat and sneaks up on him and puts it on his shoulders. Now, that means nothing to us, because we're like, if you were going, well, I guess, was Elisha cold and he needed a coat? No, that wasn't it. This coat is often called his mantle. It's his endorsement of Elisha as the person who's going to succeed and be the successor to Elijah, the greatest of the miracle working prophets. And so he sneaks up to him, puts his mantle on the back of him, and then just keeps on walking. And Elisha takes one look at it, and the next verse says this: Elisha left the oxen standing there and went after Elijah and said to him, "First, let me go and kiss my father and mother goodbye, and then I will go with you," Elijah replied. And Elijah replied, "Go on back, but think about what I've done to you." Like he says, listen, this is a big deal. Elisha immediately recognizes what Elijah was doing. He put his cloak, he put his mantle on him. He was calling him to be his follower, his disciple. And Elisha immediately responds and sees that following Elijah, the greatest of the miracle working prophets, is better than being the leader of Shaphat Farms, right? And better than inheriting, better than doing all those things. And he says, "Elijah, let me run back and say goodbye to my mom and dad." And Elijah says, "Absolutely, go for it. Go ahead and go back, say goodbye to your mom and dad, and follow me. But don't ever forget that I've put my mantle, I've put my endorsement on you." So he does exactly that. He returned, told his mom and dad goodbye, and then it says this: he returned to the oxen and slaughtered them. He used the woods from the plow to build a fire and roast their flesh. He passed around the meat to the townspeople, and they all ate. And then he went with Elijah, look at these last few words, as his assistant. Now that sounds really good. We're like, oh man, he's the assistant to the greatest of the miracle working prophets. And this is way better than like in the office when he's saying, "I'm the assistant to the regional manager." You're not the assistant regional manager, you're the assistant to the regional manager. Like this is a big deal, but it doesn't seem like it. And it sounds, wait a second, like it's not a big deal at all. Because in the next 18 years, Elisha is Elijah's assistant. He's his assistant. And you know what we get out of those 18 years of Elisha's life? We get one detail buried at the very end of one verse in the next book, in 2 Kings chapter 3. It says this about Elisha: he used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. That's all we get. 18 years. So like 18 years, he's been a follower, the assistant to Elijah. And what is it he does? In all of the Bible, we get one detail about those 18 years. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. You're probably going, well, is there more in the next verse? Nope, nothing more. He was the hand sanitizer guy. Like Elisha would have been a pro in 2020s, right? Like he would have been a pro in these years because he's the dude who walks up after the meet and greet with Elijah and hanging out with the people. He's the guy with the Purell. He unzips his fanny pack, goes over, gives him a little squirt of Purell, washes his hands off, and then goes on back to his thing. For 18 years, all we get out of his life is this ongoing consistency of being Elijah's assistant. He's the guy who poured water on Elijah's hands. Then there's this story, after those 18 years have concluded, there's this point where Elijah knows that time is coming to an end. So after 18 years, we have almost no detail of what happens, but we do know that he's been following closely the man of Elijah, the greatest of the miracle working prophets. And he comes up to a river, comes up to a place where he can't get across. And Elijah takes his cloak, the same cloak that he had given to Elisha, that he took back as the symbolism that you're going to be what's next. He took his cloak and he takes this jacket and smacks it on the water, and the water splits wide open and they separate. And they walk through on dry land. And it says this in 1 Kings, the tail end of the 18 years. He says, when they came to the other side, Elijah said to Elisha, "Tell me what I can do for you before I am taken away." And Elisha replied, "Please let me inherit a double share of your spirit and become your successor." So he sees this unbelievable man that he's been pouring water on his hands for 18 years, just doing whatever needs to be done for him. And at the end of those 18 years, he says, "What can I do for you?" And he says, "Give me a double portion." Now, that's a bold ask, right? A double portion of your blessing, a double portion of what's happened to you. 14 miracles, I want 28, right? I want to be significant. I want to be the follower of you. I want to be your successor, and I want to be better. I want to just be everything you've been plus. And Elijah says this to him in reply. "You've asked a difficult thing," Elijah replied. If you see me when I'm taken from you, then you will get your request. But if not, then you won't. That's kind of a little mysterious, right? A little mystic, right? I mean, Elijah says, if you're watching when I go, then you'll get to go. Then you'll get your request. But if not, don't. Can you imagine what Elisha was thinking? Elisha's going, he's like, I don't want to blink. I don't want to be the guy who blinks. You're not going to sneak off into the, behind a bush and die on my watch. I want to watch, because if I watch and I see you when you go, then I'll get everything that I'm hoping for. I'm get double measure of what has been put on your life. And he's excited about it. And then here's what's crazy. As they were walking, it says this, suddenly a chariot of fire appeared, drawn by horses of fire. It drove between the two men, separating them, and Elijah was carried away by a whirlwind into heaven. Can you imagine Elijah's mind? Elisha's mind just explodes, right? He's like, I thought when you went, you'd be like, you'd sit down one day and not give it up, and I'd look over or get a sandwich out of the cooler and look back and you're dead, and I missed it. But he's like, I couldn't have missed this. Elijah knew full well that what was going to happen next was that he was going to be carried away in a chariot of fire. No dying for Elijah, right? He's gonna mount up in a chariot made of fire, drawn by horses made of fire, is going to shoot off into the heavens, right? Air Horse One, right? Come on, that's funny, right? Head off into heaven, and there's going to be this unbelievable thing that Elisha is going to get to see, and he wouldn't miss it. He knew full well that he was never going to miss that kind of thing. And he's carried off in a whirlwind, and you know what falls off in the process? His cloak, this mantle, this responsibility, this endorsement that Elijah gave to Elisha in the field, that Elijah used to split the water, and then he walked through on dry land. The same mantle that he was given falls to the ground, and Elisha gets it and puts it on and carries it. And what's crazy about it is he says that he picked up, in the next verses, says he picked up Elijah's cloak, which had fallen when he was taken up. Then Elisha returned to the bank of the Jordan River, and he struck the water with Elijah's cloak and cried out, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And then the river divided, and Elisha went across. And here's the key thing for us. Here's this question that you and I have to ask, is how do we go from here, where we are today, like plowing the fields, right, to this place where we're used by God, where our life is the kind of life we dream about having? That's what was going on in Elisha's life. He was in the field doing just fine, right? I mean, the son of a very, very rich man at Shaphat Farms, right? He's the successor to Shaphat Farms. All the dreams, all the hopes, all the things that he wanted for life, except for one thing. He dreamed of maybe one day being the successor to one of the greatest prophets ever known. And that prophet, Elijah, shows up and puts his cloak on him. And he immediately says, Shaphat Farms is nothing compared to doing exactly this. And he set his dramatic change of life in a whole different direction. All because of this one moment where Elijah kind of cast a vision for him where life was bigger than he considered it could be. But you know what he did? He changed because there was a moment, a crisis that happened in life. You know, one of the things that we constantly see in our lives, the reason that we stay where we are instead of setting out goals and desires and setting out a pattern of behavior that would take us to where our dreams want to be, the reason we do that is because you and I struggle because we're comfortable where we are. Usually we change. And what we see in this story, what we see in every story of somebody significantly changing their life is that crisis creates action, doesn't it? Whether it's a crisis of like one moment when Elijah walks into the field and puts his cloak on him and it makes him choose, do I want to go this way or that way? And he chooses quickly that he wants to follow Elijah. Or maybe it's where a mom, like all of a sudden finds the strength to pick up a car because it's going to kill her child. Where does that strength come from? It comes from the crisis. The crisis creates the action. And that's one of the things that we have to figure out is, are we going to wait in our life right now are we going to just wait here until a crisis happens and that is the thing that moves us forward? How is it that you and I go from where we are now to the life that we dream could possibly be possible for us in 5 years, where do we go from our dreams to our life if we don't have a crisis? The crisis creates action in us, but we have to figure out a way to live life differently without having to have an external crisis. Like, for instance, if you said, hey, in 5 years, I want to be able to bench press my weight, right? And you were like, well, I like being lazy right now, right? But I want to one day be able to bench press my weight. How do we move from the lazy me now to the me that can bench press my weight in 5 years? Well, how do we do that? We have to choose to leave where we are. Now, your weightlifting regimen can't be, you know what I do? Is I have somebody randomly hurt my child, and then adrenaline kicks in and I can pick up a car. That's my weightlifting regimen. No, we can't wait for the external crisis to come in. We have to create an internal crisis, something in us that goes, why don't I move forward now instead of waiting for the crisis to happen? That's the kind of people we have to be. And that's exactly what Elijah and Elisha's story tells us, is that there are maybe a few different pieces of this story. And I feel like there's kind of three movements in Elisha's story that you and I can learn from that move us forward in our faith story and move us forward in our life story toward the life that you're dreaming of. The first one that happens in this story is that Elisha makes a drastic change. We have to have this drastic change in our life that moves us forward because like Tony Robbins says, change happens when the pain of staying the same is greater than the pain of change, right? The change in our life happens when you go, you know what? Changing is more valuable than staying the same. You and I have to make a drastic change. We learned this whole idea of drastic change from a brick, to be honest with you. I mean, it's a great example of it. Sir Isaac Newton said that the first law of motion is this, that every object, like a brick, right? Every object will remain at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless compelled to change by its state by the action of an external force. So really what that means is that objects at rest, like this brick, will tend to stay at rest unless acted on by an outside force. Unless something like my hand comes in and moves the brick, right? The object, your life, will tend to stay in its current state, in its straight and uniform motion, go in the direction that it's going right now until acted on by an outside force. Sometimes that outside force can be a crisis that comes in. Like you can read, if you pick up a book about FBI negotiators and hostage situations, how often families without any resources all of a sudden can come up with a ransom. Why? Because the pain of staying the same is outweighed by the importance of what the change is going to require, right? They find the money. Why? Because they have to. What could you do if you had to? Maybe you're going, man, I don't know if I can give up eating sugar. Well, if you found out that you had to stay alive, I bet you could figure out a way to give up sugar. I bet if you figured out that the pain of staying the same is outweighed by the pain of change, then you'd figure out pretty quickly that I've got to do something. My life will stay at rest until I choose to make a drastic change. And that's what Elisha did. Elisha chose to say, you know what? I'm no longer going to plow the farm fields. I'm no longer going to live in comfort. I'm going to change the direction of my life. Let me go kiss mom and dad goodbye and peace out for a second because I'm going to make a drastic change in my life. What dramatic change do you need to make in your life to move your life off of the rested state into a place where you're going forward, toward the you that you want to be in 5 years? That's important for us to understand these things because it's important for us to get that our life will remain the same unless we make a drastic change. What's the drastic change that you need to make that moves your life from where you are now to toward pointed in a direction where you want to be in 5 years? The second movement of the story that Elisha tells for us is that it's not just the drastic change. That's the short-term intensity that we talked about last week. Short-term intensity is important, but it's not nearly as valuable as long-term consistency. And that's what we get from Elisha's story in kind of the second movement. 18 years. 18 years he lives as Elijah's assistant, pouring water on the hands of Elijah, listening to Elijah, learning from Elijah, walking with Elijah. I'm sure there were times where he felt like, I want to move this forward faster than this. I thought when I said goodbye to Shaphat Farms that I was going to immediately be this. I'm sure there were times where he wanted to rush through it, but 18 years goes by before the first sign of any kind of change in pattern. So not only do we need to have a drastic action on our side, we also need to apply, number 2, steady progression in one direction. For 18 years, Elisha applied steady, consistent attention and steady, consistent progression in one direction. And that was what won the day. It's what made him arrive at the life that he believed he could have. I love the way that it's Epictetus is the philosopher's name. He said, "No great thing created suddenly any more than a bunch of grapes or a fig. If you tell me you desire a fig, I answer that there must be a time. Let it first blossom and then bear fruit and then ripen." What he's telling us is that you don't create grapes, you don't create a fig, you don't create a plant, and you don't create a life that you want in 5 years. You don't create that today. You build that over 5 years. I love the way that Darren Hardy says this in his book. He says this: "There is no magic bullet, secret formula, or quick fix to success. You don't make $200,000 a year by spending 2 hours a day on the internet, lose 30 pounds in a week with a Hollywood diet, rub 20 years off of your face with a cream, fix your love life with a pill, or find lasting success with a get-rich-quick scheme. It would be great if you could buy your success, self-esteem, good relationships, health, and well-being in a nicely clamshelled package at the local Walmart. But that's just not how it works. You and I have to choose to apply steady progression in one direction to our life. The way that you get from the last week, next step, dream about where you want to be, to the actual living that life is to make a drastic, a momentary change in your life and then apply immediately following that with steady progression in one direction. You'll not get there unless you apply steady progression in one direction. I love the way they say that John Maxwell says this. He says, "Improvement doesn't happen in one day, but it must happen daily." Let me say that again. Improvement doesn't happen in one day, but it does happen daily. That steady progression in one direction is exactly what Elisha applied to his life that pointed him not only in the direction, the dramatic change, kiss mom and dad goodbye. The steady progression, 18 years pouring water, being the hand sanitizer guy for Elijah, was his steady progression in one direction, and it ultimately ended with Elijah handing him the mantle and riding off in a chariot of fire, following exactly the life that he'd had. And that's really the third part. What you get to experience in your life when you've applied a drastic change followed by steady progression in one direction, what you get to enjoy is momentum. That's important because what he got to see and he got to experience in his story was that his drastic change followed by steady progression in one direction and enjoyed momentum in his life. Because just like the law of motion we learned about from Isaac Newton, is that not just objects at rest will stay at rest, but objects in motion will tend to stay in motion in one uniform direction once we've applied that steady progression in one direction. So let me just ask you this real quick question as we land this part for today. Just as, again, part 2, right, of the second part of this message series, not only the second part of this message series, but the second part of this message. Last week we said dream about where you want to go in 5 years. And this week, I just want to help us understand how we get from there to living that life is we apply drastic action followed by steady progression in one direction, and then we enjoy the momentum. So let me ask you this important question as your next step for today. What is your drastic action? What is it? Do we need to change something up dramatic about the way the people in your life that you listen to? That's a drastic action. Now you have to apply steady progression in one direction after that, but maybe you need to make some changes about the people that you listen to in life. Or maybe you're going, man, I want to get my finances in order. So what's the drastic action? Maybe you need to sell some stuff so that you can pay off some bills with that like kind of gazelle intensity and all of a sudden make a dramatic change. Or maybe you need to change jobs and say, you know what, I need a more dependable, regular income. That's not going to fix it. That's not going to give you that life. What that is the drastic change that begins to take you that direction. The steady application of progression in one direction is what will give you that life. But what's the drastic change that you need to make? Maybe you need to delete some people off your phone. Maybe you just need to go, that person cannot be a part of my life if I'm gonna change things dramatically. Maybe you need to run in different circles. Maybe you need to change careers. What's the thing that you need to do first so that you can apply steady progression in one direction and arrive in an entirely different place? It's not enough to dream. Dreaming's great, but drastic action followed by significant and steady progression in one direction is what allows us the opportunity to enjoy sustained momentum. So what's your drastic action? What is it that you're going to change? What direction are you going to change in your life so that you can become the you that you dream about being in just 5 years?